we deserve to heal, and that something good is within us, and that we can always be stronger and better. That's what I hope my life and my work help connect folks to. And that's what I think is the thing that when we're in distress, that we're being called in some way. Something about our life is saying, no, remember who you are. You belong here. You deserve to be at ease. You deserve to feel at home and to feel like you can thrive and flourish, no matter where you come from, no matter what the world is telling you right now about where you belong. You deserve this, or else you wouldn't be here. That's, to me, what life itself tells us. We belong here.
And recognizing that we are struggling is the first step towards healing. Hey, my friends, this is Nishant, and welcome to another episode of the Nishant Garg Show. My mission is to help people get in touch with their emotions and feelings, connect with themselves, and being a source of healing. My job on the show is to sit with the world-class experts to deconstruct the practices, routines, and habits to help you live a fulfilled and abundant life. Every Friday, I share an exclusive email to the newsletter subscribers, which mentions what I'm learning, recent podcast updates, things I'm experimenting with, books I'm reading, and much, much more. You can find the newsletter link at my website, https://nishantgarg.me, nishantgarg.me. And today's guest is Rhonda Magee. Rhonda is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco and an internationally recognized thought and practice leader focused on integrating mindfulness into higher education, law, and social change work. She is a prolific author and draws on law and legal history to weave storytelling, poetry, analysis, and practices into inspiration for changing how we think, act, and live better together in a rapidly changing world. She teaches mindfulness-based interventions, awareness, and compassion practices from a range of traditions. Rhonda's teachings and writing support compassionate conflict engagement and management, holistic problem solving to alleviate the suffering of the vulnerable and injured, presence-based leadership in a diverse world, and humanizing approaches to education. She has served as a guest teacher in a variety of mindfulness teacher training programs, including those sponsored by the Mindfulness Awareness Research Center, the Engaged Mindfulness Institute, and the Center for Mindfulness. She serves as a retreat co-leader and solo teacher at centers including Spirit Rock Meditation Center, the Garrison Institute, the Shambhala Mountain Center, the Omega Institute, and New York's Insight Meditation Center. And now, without further ado, please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Rhonda Magee. Rhonda, welcome to the show.
Thank you so very much. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you so much. And we have many directions we can go in. And I want to start with a foreword from Jon Kabat-Zinn. He wrote for your book. Your book, the author of The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities. So I will state one passage from the foreword. We are faced with the paradox that we have to do our own inner work if we hope to wake up to and embody the fullness of who we really are. No one can do it for us. Yet, at the same time, we need one another to function as mirrors to point out where we are most aware and most blind. So, Rhonda, I want to ask you, what is your relationship with Jon Kabat-Zinn?
Thank you so much. Well, we're definitely, I would say he's been a teacher and in some ways a mentor of mine, and certainly a friend as well. We met, I believe it was probably about almost 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, when we were each separately asked to participate in an event on bringing mindfulness into the social realm and into engagement with some of the most difficult problems of our time. So it was a conference or an engagement in New York City, as I recall, around mindfulness and ethics as a way of being in the world. And my name had been put forth because of some of the work I had been doing starting in the early 2000s to bring mindfulness into law as a law professor and as a network of a small, very small then, certainly growing now, but a network of folks who were, I would say, early, if not pioneers, certainly some of the early practice and thought innovators around bringing mindfulness into law and public policy. And so I guess John is the person you think of if one is thinking about bringing in someone who's brought mindfulness into medicine and public health. And so folks were looking around for someone who had experimented with bringing mindfulness into law. So I say that with like a smile on my face, because the very thought that like whatever I had done in law was in any way equivalent to what John had done in medicine was like laughable then and now, I would say. But however it happened to be, we ended up being on the same stage, a small group of us, and representing different ways that we might bring mindfulness together. And John and I had a connection right from the start that has just led to me continuing to kind of learn from him and grow with him. Up until then, I'd been studying mindfulness from more of a Buddhist perspective. I had been working with a teacher here in the Bay Area, and we were in a small group being encouraged to translate what we were learning from our teacher, Norman Fisher, former abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center. We were being encouraged by Norman and in our small group of practice, only about 10 or 12 of us, to do some of that work of translating from our Buddhist training and practice and what we were doing in our community of practice, our little lawyer sangha. What we were doing there, we were translating it into a plan for a retreat for lawyers, which we had started to offer, retreats for lawyers, and classes at law schools, which I had started to offer. And so we were doing that bit of work. And it was only after having been toiling in that field for a while that I met John and learned even about mindfulness-based stress reduction. And it just, in our conversation on stage, it was so clear that we were very aligned, though our backgrounds and lineages were different. And we just connected from there. And he's had a hard time kind of shaking me ever since.
What values do you both share?
Well, I think kind of fundamentally, we deeply value life and the opportunities that living with some intentionality and purposefulness might avail, right? Basically, I think there's a certain way in which we both resonate with the idea that we have this one life to live. And with some humility, if we can do the best we can, starting where we are, those commitments might, in some small way, do more, well, let's just say, minimize the extent to which we do harm, and maybe support others in taking what steps anyone may to minimize harm and difficulty in the world. I do think those kinds of core basic ethics are at the foundation of what resonates between us. But we come to that each from different but very deep commitments to traditional forms of development of the capacity to engage in the world from a place of ethics. Again, he was obviously deeply involved in medicine, before that biology. He has a PhD and studied at MIT and in the hard sciences. For me, it was social sciences, sociology. I was in graduate school studying how people resolve conflict before I went to law school. So both of us, I think, were very committed to using these institutions of higher education and law and medicine to do what we might do to make some sort of difference. But we both had the crazy idea that somehow we might also infuse our work in those institutions with what we had been privileged to learn about awareness, about compassion, about how to disrupt some of the trainings and inherited ways of thinking and being that have their positive benefits, but at the same time, seen clearly, are also part of what we are struggling against as we try to minimize harm in the world. So I think we both had these crazy ideas that we would get inside some huge institutions that have a mind certainly of their own and a kind of a deep, formidable trainings and ways, and actually try to change them. So I think we recognize that kind of impulse in each other, and then I think also just like a love of awareness and compassion. And again, that ties back to just a love of life itself that I think we both recognize in each other. Those are the kinds of things that I think of in response to your good question about our values.
Thank you for explaining, Rhonda. And I don't know John personally, but his name has come up in almost all the episodes. He is like a godfather in the mindfulness space.
Yes.
His name is there in all the podcast episodes. His name and Jack Confield's name everywhere.
Yes. Yeah.
If any of our listener is new to mindfulness, then how do you describe mindfulness in a lay language? Somebody who is very new in this mindfulness meditation world.
I think for me, mindfulness it's a term, of course, that's everywhere. So this again is another very good question I think we have to ask it of each of us and of ourselves probably regularly, because how we use that term can be so different from one person to the next, one context to the next. For me, on the one hand, I use the term to talk about certain specific kinds of practices, things we can do, and commitments we can make that have been shown anecdotally and more scientifically to promote deepening awareness and compassion, perspective taking, empathy in the social realm, waking up, frankly, to the moments of our lives and the great potential inherent in each of them. So on the one hand, it's about specific practices that support us in paying attention, as John would say, on purpose in a particular way, with a certain attitude of curiosity and openness and friendly receptivity to what's coming up, to be met and related to with some wisdom, ideally. So it's really about, the practices that support that kind of paying attention and being more present in our lives. But on the other hand, it's not as simple as just being about these practices. It's really, for me anyway, it's about, the underlying ethical commitment that I think is sort of the first principle, or where we begin before we really commit to mindfulness. For me, it begins with this view, this sense that my life matters, the things I do matter, how I engage with life makes a difference beyond my own experience. And so there is then a kind of set of broader teachings, sort of a whole philosophical tradition, a kind of broader set of commitments to practicing not just as an individual, but in communities or in ways that connect us up with others. So this idea of practicing, but also practicing in community and learning and being a lifelong student, and just the way of being that can result when you are committed to those things is another thing that comes up for me when I think about what mindfulness means.
If I understand correctly, you are saying that mindfulness is for individuals, and how do we use mindfulness in communities? And Rhonda, I want to ask you about your personal mindfulness practice.
So I have to say, I'm a little bit unruly sometimes with my own practice in terms of like when during the day I do it, but I'm committed to practicing every day. And mostly that's a morning practice where it's a formal sitting meditation practice. And it involves, for me, it's grounded foundationally in what we often call awareness of breath and body practice, just sitting and calming the mind, calming the body by taking as an object of awareness the body breathing and the position of the body and as it breathes and rests. And from that kind of core practice, other practices are part of my regular daily routine or grind, depending on what it feels like in the day. But they might be, I spend a lot of time engaging in some form of loving kindness practice, which is one of four kind of ways of thinking about what's called the noble abodes that arise when one practices on a regular basis, kind of noble ways of inhabiting experience. Loving kindness is one, compassion is another. Mudita is the word that was coming to mind, but sympathetic joy, joy in the joy of others is the third. And then equanimity, that flow and that ability to kind of move with what arises and kind of be in some state of balance, some kind of practice for just being able to shift as things shift with more ease, equanimity. So for me, the practices are grounded, of course, in just the basic sitting and breathing. But there are the Brahma Viharas, the four noble abodes that I just described, are also regular practices for me. Movement practices, simple yoga movement practices, but also walking meditation and Qigong actually is a practice that I've been exposed to and find very enlivening. And also journaling, and I see my writing as a practice. So now we're shifting into some of the more informal practices that I also engage in. So from those formal practices of a period of time, I would say on average somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes in sitting practice, but it varies. And I engage in that kind of practice once or twice most days. And those formal practices in the morning, afternoon, evening, typically about twice a day. And then these other more informal practices and kind of moments of mindfulness are also what I draw on to support me in down-regulating when I'm getting distressed, perhaps after I've imbibed just a little too much social media or news or had a difficult conversation with some colleague at work or something. So there are a variety of informal breathing and, let's say, whole body practices for settling and grounding that I also regularly rely on as part of my practice journey.
How do you deal with difficult conversations, and how do you resolve conflicts in any difficult conversation if happens to be?
So just to say to pick up on the thread of what we've already been talking about, again, mindfulness as a support for these things. For me, mindfulness, another way of saying what that is it's really about how we relate to anything. And that includes, these difficulties that arise. And so bringing the practices that I've been referring to into life is for me about just being more present to, whatever it is that I'm calling a difficulty. What are the inputs of that in an embodied sense? Is it a sudden like sucking in a breath, or like a sudden feeling in the pit of my stomach where I'm feeling some fear or anxiety? What is that difficulty from the place actually of the body? That's usually where I find the most support, frankly, for regulating. First of all, for noticing when I'm getting dysregulated, right? Because it's not really primarily an intellectual event, although we tend to think of conflict as primarily an intellectual event. Mm-hmm. The body will tell us that whatever thoughts we have are interwoven with emotions, with bodily sensations. And mindfulness is a way for me of, catching myself in the act of whatever might be threatening to cause me to kind of armor up and do what I've been trained to do as a lawyer, to go up in my head and get argumentative and prove a point or whatever it might be. So, there are many ways I could talk about this, but as a kind of a basic first approximation to how I think mindfulness helps me with conflict, it's because it helps me notice the first kind of signs of a way of relating to something that's showing up. That's about, in the core teachings of Buddhism, which have formed a lot of the original wisdom for what we call mindfulness. The idea is there's these three poisons that one way or another are often at the root of what makes happy or dissatisfied or troubled. And those poisons are, some version of attaching to something that needs to be let go of in some way, or is it like all things kind of shifting in some way, but we've got to way we're holding it in a fixed way. So attachment is one way, one of the poisons, if you will. Aversion, pushing something away that actually is kind of here, wants to be known, some aspect of my experience that I kind of don't want to look at. So aversion can be a part of what might be going on when I might be feeling myself in conflict. And then the third poison is confusion or delusion, or just being in a fog of not knowing. Again, all of these three dynamics may actually be sort of showing up in those moments when I'm feeling some conflict or some anxiety, whether it be about race or racism, some microaggression, some incident that I see that makes me quite sad or angry or, enraged in a moment, whatever it might be. And so for me, mindfulness helps me become regularly committed to being more capable of responding rather than reacting when I'm triggered. And it doesn't mean somehow pacifying myself or somehow becoming this sort of bland person that doesn't feel things. No, I feel things quite strongly, but it is about being more present to what I'm feeling. If I'm going to feel something, let myself feel it fully, as opposed to trying to stuff it or fix it. And so it's really helping develop that kind of skillful engagement with what we call emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, and then intelligent responses to our emotions and then to the emotions of others. The social dynamics of that are also another way that mindfulness, I think, can support us.
Where do you feel in your body during the times of conflict? Where in your body do you feel sensations?
It varies so much. It depends on the particular conflict, right? So,
or can you give us a recent example?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that. And I'm now going to reference Jon Kabat-Zinn's work, Full Catastrophe Living, just the book that he made famous. One of the chapters in there is called People Stress. And it is about how our interactions with others can be stressful. And like anybody else involved in many different circles of connection and relationships in the workplace, in mindfulness circles, and in my family. And so there are just myriad different opportunities in life to experience some kind of conflict. And so I'm thinking of a conflict that I recently had with a colleague at work. And actually, I've had conflicts at work with colleagues over the years. And sometimes I've written about some of the ways that mindfulness has assisted me. And one of those that I wrote about, to take it outside of a current situation, but when I put out in the world, and can talk about it here because it's still a very lively kind of thing, was a kind of an engagement with another teacher where I felt the teacher was making assumptions about me and the value of my work, assumptions that embedded some kind of bias around me as a Black woman. And I really was feeling slighted and sort of disregarded. I felt she was minimizing the substantive contributions of my work. And because she said something along the lines of, you're only being asked to participate in this because you're Black. And this is the kind of thought that I know occurs to people sometimes. But for whatever reason, she said that. And it was hurtful. She and I had worked together for years, and I trusted her and believed that she saw me fairly fully. So this is one of those things where it's not clear when you hear something like this exactly how to interpret it. Is this a comment not about her feelings, but about her thoughts about how someone else views me? Or on the other hand, is it a way in which some kind of hidden anxiety or assumption or conflict that she's working out in relationship to me is somehow coming to the fore? So in terms of the analysis of what was going on, it wasn't clear, but I know it was a hurtful comment. I know that how did I know that? Because I felt in my body a sense of almost like being physically hit. So weakness kind of in the belly area, right? To answer your question of like, how does this feel in the body?
May I ask you, what was the emotional trigger when she said that you're Black?
So the trigger was just this thought that she's dismissing, again, who I am. This whole, of course, we all think of ourselves as many things. And we know, right, that the way we interact in the world and the connections we make with people are inspired by many things. And so when someone reduces it it would have been equally as painful, I think, if she had said, you've only been asked to do this because you're a woman, or because any single story about who I am and how that contributed, I would have been reactive to. Right. And of course, as happens, this colleague is a white racialized woman. So when the particular comment is one that's bringing up this racial difference, yeah, it does have the added kind of stickiness of that long history of the difficulty and the divide between people of differently racialized backgrounds. And I use the term racialized to underscore that I do consider race to be in alignment with the majority of social scientists and even genetic scientists today. Race to be more of a social construction than anything else. But by social, I mean it's constructed in these kinds of social conversations like the one she and I were having, where all of a sudden race was a factor and all kinds of ideas about what these racialized labels mean. What does it mean to be a Black person? So that was now in the conversation, whereas it had not been before. And when it comes into the conversation, it doesn't come alone, right? It's coming in with my own, some way in which a history, a life of engagement around race and racism is kind of being brought into the conversation, and a set of questions about what it means to relate to white-bodied or white racialized people or lighter skinned people. Many ways to talk about the experience of those who are considered white. In those moments, there can be any of a number of different ways that my own decades of experience around this are also suddenly in the conversation. And my decades of pain and questions and difficulty I've had interacting with people from differently racialized backgrounds, all of that might be in the room, right? So when you ask what is triggered, it's really, it's no one thing, but it's some version, something is coming into the fore or being brought into closer engagement or more to the fore of my mind and body and experience that is about some of the ways I've experienced race and racism in my life. And then questions about some of the ways that she has experienced race and racism in her life. What does she know about a person like me, such that if I'm invited to engage in something, she could just assume that the reason has to do with race as opposed to something else about me. Something else about what I contribute, something about what I contribute, maybe in addition to race. So it was just all of these sorts of both questions and concerns were coming up. And so breathing helped. But what ultimately helped the two of us was an intentional practice that we engaged in around metta, loving kindness, which I mentioned earlier as being a regular daily aspect of my practice. She and I had the same teacher, and he suggested that we practice loving kindness meditation with each other in mind, because I've truncated this story. Of course, she had a reaction to my reaction, right? She didn't mean to hurt my feelings or to minimize who I am. So there was a whole kind of back and forth that ensued that I'm obviously fully unpacking here. But in other words, we both had issues and feelings and reactions and triggers. And so we engaged in this practice of loving kindness reflection with each other in mind. And it, I think, was a significant part of how it came to be that in time, not in, one day, but that was a thread that helped us stay in connection and kind of access the rest of our experience, a history, the relationship that we had been building. In other words, that practice, I think, was not the only thing, but it was one of the things that helped me find my way back to a willingness to continue engaging and to continue finding my way back to a trusting friendship with her. And that came to pass after some time.
Which is great. Thank you for explaining, Rhonda. If there is a conflict, there is always a joy. So what activities gives you joy in life?
Well, I think just living. This sounds funny to say it, but I think conflict is part of life. And living, let's say, with some sort of courage, with some sort of willingness to be present and not to sleepwalk through life. These are the things that bring me joy. That sometimes means engaging around whatever's coming up with a little bit more courage, with a little bit more love for myself, for those who are involved. But it sometimes means pulling back, taking a break, painting or dancing and listening to music, right? I draw on the full range of human supports for joy. And I really I wouldn't feel as certain that I could continue engaging around these difficult issues of identity, turning toward rather than away from racism and other forms of isms, other forms of othering, exclusion, xenophobia, caste-like behaviors that we do. I wouldn't be able to turn toward those things rather than away from them and create these opportunities for myself and others to come together and courageously talk about and unpack what's going on around that stuff for us. If there wasn't just some love in there, always love for my own experience in the world, for all of us who have suffered, in my view, way too much around these issues, and just joy that comes from, again, what feels to me like at least the possibility, just the possibility we might do better than we have, give more and better, and do more and better than we have been trained or have received to this point. We can look around and see that we need to do better about creating a sense of ourselves as one human family, struggling on a planet where absolutely everything is connected in a time of great resource inequality, right? So we know we need to do better to figure out how to live in peace and some form of harmony on this planet. And so for me, there's joy in doing what I can to be a part of what at least feels on most days like a movement in the direction of that kind of positive change.
And I want to underscore race and racism. Are you comfortable to talk about race and racism from your own personal experience? Could be from your childhood days and your adulthood life.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, even the conversation I mentioned with the colleague is an example of that, but certainly even more I'm happy to talk with you about.
Yes, and in the preparation of this conversation, I read that you were born in North Carolina and you experienced a childhood of significant trauma and challenge. Can you expand on that, if that is okay?
Yeah. So one thing that I guess I could say about that is I was born in a family that where we were descended from generations of people who had been enslaved, and after enslavement in North Carolina and other parts of the South, relegated to the kinds of positions that they would have held in a slave society by virtue of the commitments to segregation and the maintenance of white supremacy through segregation that followed with a vengeance after slavery ended or was ended after the Civil War and that brief period that we call Reconstruction, right? So there was the period after enslavement, and then there was a little bit of possibility during the period we call Reconstruction. But within a generation, we had basically mapped white supremacy onto this system of segregation. And my family lived through all of that. My grandmother, for example, was born a couple of generations, maybe in some sense just one generation. She was born actually in 1906 in North Carolina. And so her grandmother and her closest aunt had been enslaved. And so she had lived a life in segregation in the United States. That meant that she didn't have a lot of opportunities for education. Certainly she didn't have the opportunities that I had. And my grandmother's life is just one example. My mother, therefore, didn't have very many opportunities. And on my father's side, I could tell a very similar story. And therefore, we didn't have a lot of economic supports for thriving, right? Everybody was working in these jobs of working in a shirt factory or cleaning houses for other people. And so it was that kind of very working class, very humble, often impoverished kind of circumstances that my people came from. And when that's a feature of one's life, coupled with all of the deep trainings of white supremacy and how that lands in the lives of Black racialized people, with a constant refrain of where you don't belong and what you're not capable of, I think it's not uncommon that there can be the legacies of that showing up in people's lives, of how the difficulty of bearing up with different messages about not belonging and racism and discrimination. So my father and stepfather joined the military to try and escape some of these patterns in their lives. And then they having experienced racism before, during, and after the military, both of them ended up drinking too much, having problems with alcoholism. And so as a child, impoverishment, the legacies of racism, now we add alcoholism, some physical abuse in the household, and different types of abuse in the household. These are the kinds of, I think, interlocking consequences that should surprise no one when people have descended from circumstances that are embedded in generations of systemic suffering. And this
And
isn't to say that
multi-generational trauma.
everybody, and trauma. Yeah, and multi-generational trauma. And so it's not to say that everybody who goes through this also suffers in the way that I did, but I will say that my family did and I did.
It's trauma. It doesn't matter how big or small it is. It is something that you live with. So Rhonda, when did you recognize that you are going through this trauma?
Well,
was there any awareness around this?
Yeah, I was aware as a child. I really was. I mean, and again, I have to say that I am also aware that every individual has these certain personalities that we're kind of born with and dispositions that we're born with. And I was probably predisposed to being kind of that type of curious, introspective child. So very early on, I knew there was abuse. I witnessed abuse in the household and experienced my own. And I also knew there had to be something more somehow. Like I just really early on knew that my life was not, that I really wasn't born to suffer and to just be mired in abuse. And maybe that's partly because though there was all of this different types of abuse around, my parents separated early. There was violence that my mother was escaping, but violence we met when she remarried, and on and on and on. There was also my grandmother and others around us had interpreted Christianity in a certain way to allow them to feel a bit of resourcedness around just making the most of these difficult circumstances. So my grandmother had been called to the ministry, and one of the ways that showed up in a positive sense for me was that I saw her getting up before dawn every day. She would, in her own way, center herself. For her, it was prayer based, right? She was reading the Bible early every day and centering and reflecting on that, and basically reconnecting with a sense of source and purpose before she came out even of her own bedroom and got us kids started on the day, before she cooked for us and then went on to do the work she was doing, again, cleaning houses for others. So not glamorous work at all, but every day she found a way to center herself and to feel a sense of purpose and, frankly, her own wisdom, her own ability maybe to teach and offer. And so I grew up really seeing that here was a Black woman who had not been dealt some great set of cards and opportunities, but she was able to make the most of them. And again, this is not a Pollyanna story. This isn't about like trying to say everybody, no matter what our circumstances, all you have to do is just pray and meditate. Although I do think prayer and meditation helps, because I think that we do need to bring these practices to bear in our efforts to make the world a better place, so that we don't see these ongoing intergenerational, right, traumatic, the ongoing effects of that in our world. We need to do something to minimize that, I believe. But I do think it's all both and. It's like we begin with ourselves and we do what we can, and we don't want to miss the opportunity that our life presents for us to effectuate some kind of healing and some kind of justice right where we are. And from how we are with ourselves and how we are with those around us, if we can't maximize the potential for whatever the vision of the good is that we're hoping will arrive on some distant day in the world, right? If we can't bring that into our own lives, then I think we really are missing really the point, which is to say that whatever for me justice and equity might be in the world, it has to start with me. And let's say, I don't mean to say I get to the point where I feel completely healed before working with others to make the world better. I think the work that we do is always multidimensional. So we can be working on ourselves, working on how we are with each other, and working to minimize violence and oppression and abuse, all the different ways that children today, just as I happen to be a bit trapped as a child myself, my goal today would be, I'd love to do whatever I can, want to do whatever I can to create a world where no child suffers ever again some of the things that I suffered. And yet I know, of course, kids are suffering right here, right now. And not only children, but the children in all of us, right? So to me, then it all becomes about trying to create places where we can heal together. And,
in the context of healing, when did you start working on yourself? Although you were curious and resilient in your childhood days, when did you really start working on healing modalities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was probably, well, I know it was in some sense in university, like at the time when I was a young adult, at the time I was in college and attending university, and just realizing that though I was actually finding a way to keep moving forward in terms of academics and school, right? I was doing well and just outperforming everybody's expectations, right? Being that good student and all of that stuff. I also knew that there are ways that in my own personal relationships, for example, I was a mess. There are ways that in my personal relationships with men, I was just carrying some of the wounds and traumas that I had experienced as a child into those relationships, not for anybody's good. I realized as well that I was often I had this idea, the image is that I had like a cloud over my head. Not that I felt that I was consciously depressed, but and I never was diagnosed as clinically depressed, but I often felt like I was needing to be vigilant, like needing to be on the lookout for threats to my well-being. And again, that kind of needing to be vigilant is not uncommon for kids who grow up in households where there's some kind of abuse. But once you're out of those households and you're bringing that kind of vigilance to your personal relationships, and you're not able to really appreciate the choices and opportunities that are before you because you're constantly thinking about where the pain points are, right? So there was some awareness in my 20s, some dawning awareness that the way I was still acting out of the place of fear and trauma that I had imbibed as a child was something that I was sort of replaying in a certain sense in my own mind as an adult. And I didn't want to do that anymore. It became too painful. The pain of doing that started, I think, as they say, to outweigh the pain or difficulty of opening up the bud of that flower and trying to find a different way to relate to the world.
Then what steps did you take after that to work on your relationship around men and in other areas of your life to deal with your fear and anxiety?
Well, I did so all the way up through this period, I was a journaler, right? So I was starting from the age of 7. I had my first diary and journal. So as I say, I was always this kind of introspective person, but I definitely felt I needed more. I had never had therapy, despite everything that we were up against as children. We didn't come from a place where anybody stepped in with resources like a therapist. So, but when I got to college, there were opportunities for therapy. And so found myself feeling like journaling and trying to do it on my own wasn't really helping as much as I needed. And so being at a university where there actually were student counseling and student mental health services and conversation circles, if you're having trouble with this issue or that issue, where you can feel like you're not alone, other students are also struggling with this, and here's a group for you. So I had all these resources all of a sudden in my 20s and I, for whatever reason, was not averse to taking advantage of them. For whatever reason, I started to look for support in the way of counseling and found some therapists. They weren't necessarily what opened all the different doors of healing, but they, I think, started to normalize for me that it's perfectly okay if you need help to get help. And even if the kinds of modalities that you might seek might not work at first, it doesn't mean you can't keep trying. So it was from exploring counseling and then in some ways, just being on a path of self-exploration and self-help, if you will, that I ultimately found books around mindfulness and meditation. And that started the journey of that part of my own self-directed healing journey.
Do you remember some of those books you read in your 20s?
Yes. The very first book that I read that described meditation was a book from the Hindu tradition. My partner's family hails from India. And we met many, many, many years ago while we were both in law school. And we came out to California together. And while he wasn't a particularly religious, he was not then, he is not now a particularly religious person. He did have this book on his shelf that I took down, and I read the spine of it and just was curious. It was called The Bhagavad Gita for daily living, right?
It's like a Bible, Hindu Holy Bible.
Yeah. And this particular reflection on it by Eknath Easwaran, this Indian immigrant to the Bay Area, who had started actually this meditation center, right? So it was the Gita and his interpretations of it and an invitation and description of how one might meditate, and then his discussion of how meditation was helping him in daily life. It was that kind of a book. And so it just really opened up this idea that there might be some way of practicing that could be of benefit. So this teacher had created this kind of secularized, I would say, to use some language from sociology, syncretized, right? It was from his own traditions in Hindu, in his own religious traditions, transported to the US and somehow kind of interpreted for a Western audience. So he created this meditation community, and I never became a part of that community. And he has since passed, since he was an elder of mine, even when I found his work. But just reading about it and then becoming more curious about, well, what is meditation and how can I develop my own maybe understanding of what that is? That started me looking at other books. The Power of Now as one book as well was one of the early books that more secular books even still that I was drawn to.
From Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah, from Eckhart Tolle. And there were just, I think along the way, I experimented with yoga and meditation, popping into a meditation center here or there. I happened to be all of that time and through to now in the San Francisco Bay Area. So there are many different opportunities for exploring these things here. And so I started in that way, reading, being curious, feeling something valuable in the reading, something that was giving me some relief, and then just continuing from there.
Going back into your 20s, you started doing counseling and therapy. What changes did you observe in yourself after that process got started?
I didn't go into a very deep or long-standing set of counseling relationships in my 20s. I would go to a counselor and go a few times and sort of feel like this isn't really helping me. And then I might go a few months and then maybe try another one or try a group somewhere. And so it was never really sustained in my 20s. But what I think came out of it was a sense of it's okay to go to counseling. And so I think for me, it was more that A, it's okay. B, you might benefit from it, right? It wasn't like I was showing up and they were saying, oh, you don't need counseling at all. They were on the one hand not saying you're a total mess, but they were also saying, oh yeah, all these things you're describing, these are the kinds of things that cause people to kind of want to work on stuff. I think it helped validate the sense that I had that I could be healthier. I could do something to help understand my mind a little bit better and not be so much a part of my own problem, if you will. So I think the early encounters I had with therapy just helped make it okay. Because again, I came from a family where no one had ever gone to any kind of therapy, right? So I was really just learning about what that might be. And then it wasn't until I was doing my own continuing journaling, self-help, meditating. And then I went through the process, fast forward into my early 30s when I had gotten married and was separated and was divorcing a relationship failure, a significant one. And it was a time where I'd been working really hard to become a tenured law professor. And again, as had been my own way, like I always had this area of my life that I was sort of doing well at: school, work, managing, right? You're managing. And yet there was a part that wasn't working so well. So going through the divorce, I went into counseling for the first time in a sustained way. And that really, I think what helped me with counseling was being in a long, regular kind of relationship where where it was safe enough for me to look at these difficult patterns and wounds and feel supported in bringing, frankly, more loving response to them, as opposed to denying my wounds or trying to educate myself past them or prove that I'm strong enough by doing all the things, becoming a lawyer, becoming a military officer, becoming a doctoral student and getting the master's. And it was like I was doing and doing and doing. And I think with counseling, I learned the really deep importance, and I learned some way of bringing a kind of loving acceptance of myself into engagement with the challenges that I was experiencing. And I will also say that my counselor knew something about meditation. She had been trained in the Naropa Institute or University, which is one of the Buddhist-inspired universities in the United States. So again, Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, you can find a counselor like this. So she understood when I was talking about, well, I'm also exploring meditation. She was able to help me lean into how it is that my meditation practice might further this kind of self-compassionate healing that I was working through with her support.
Is there a difference between counseling and therapy?
I'm not sure. As a just a layperson from that perspective, I think there are different modalities or different types of counseling, and kind of talk therapy is one kind. So I think there might be some differences. And I'm speaking here about just a basic kind of talk therapy that was a kind of counseling that I engaged in with her. And it was over a period of a couple of years, actually. And it got to the point where I kind of knew you come to a point you realize you have healed enough that this particular kind of therapy, at least I came to that point, has kind of worked its magic. And I haven't actually been in counseling again since then. But I got to that point where I was sort of like, I can imagine what the therapist is going to say. I can go ahead and imbibe that. I can apply it. I don't need to go and spend an hour in conversation about how to work with this. I kind of now know how to work with it. And so that's what the healing looked like for me.
Are you still in therapy or some sort of counseling?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I was not at all between the years of, let's say, my 30s up until now. So from 15 or so years, I had not been in any counseling. This year, or this past year, with all of the things, with coronavirus and adapting to that, and the reckonings with racism and the pain for that. I mean, I am, despite the fact that I haven't continued to be in counseling, my own meditation practice, my own commitment to self-awareness, has kept me in this sort of life journey of just understanding myself a little bit better. So I know I'm an empath. I'm a person who feels and is sort of somewhat naturally empathic. I actually did have consulted a counselor a few times just in the last few months, two different types of counselors, one kind of a talk therapy counselor, another an embodied healing kind of counselor, because deep for me, I've become very attuned to when my body is telling me I am overwhelmed or just needing a break. And yet part of how I had begun to respond to this moment of these interlocking pandemics was to take on too much and just like not give myself a break. So I stopped myself and realized I needed to stop that pattern and have availed myself of just a couple of sessions with a kind of a body worker person who kind
Somatic.
somatic practitioner who has these really beautiful supportive practices for noticing and giving me some particular kinds of body work for minimizing the sense of I'm taking on too much of the stress in the world, or I'm feeling too much the pain of this or that story that I'm working with in the world. Or actually, I do a lot of work with others who are working with racism, and the stories that are shared with me are sometimes hard, right? And if I've done a lot of engagements in a row, I can be carrying a lot of different stories about deep pain around racism, violence, hate crimes, the threat of hate crimes, sadness. And so, yes, I have worked with body somatic practitioners around that, but also because I'm in a period of transition, or I see myself as growing always, I think I've also just been working with a counselor, a couple of sessions with a counselor, just to look at the arc of my own growth at this time. Like, what am I called to do at this moment? I've got a lot of opportunities and they're great. So this was like counseling / coaching for making the most of the moments of the set of chances or set of opportunities I have today, which I've worked hard to create for myself. And now it's like, oh, I've got a lot of things. How do I choose which are the things I should be doing right now? Yeah. And so that's been a part of my journey of this year.
And it brings a follow-up question. Then what are you called to do? What are you most excited about in the upcoming years of your life?
Well, I'm writing again. So I'm actually taking this coming year off from teaching law, and I am giving myself time to write. I am deepening my own meditation practice. So that's another thing I feel called to do. And creating more space in my life for offering what, in some humble way, I seem to be being asked to offer, right? So to meet some of these calls with more of my own depth, I'm giving myself more space so that the things I do say yes to are things that I have much more, I've resourced myself more for. And so I think, that my calling right now is to meet some of the ways that this moment where we're reckoning with racism in the world, where we're dealing with multiple interlocking pandemics, including climate change and all the other things, I do feel a kind of responsibility, if you will, right? I have been privileged to explore some of the ways of resourcing for moments and times like this, but how to be in wise relationship with the opportunities that have been presented, I'm still sorting through. And so this year, it feels like the call is to give myself enough space to reconnect with the things that give me life. Writing is certainly one of them. And then working with others with the support of my writings, right? Offering workshops and practices and teachings around those things that I've been thinking about and practicing with. That's what I feel called to do. And part of that, though, is just doing my own work so that I have the resources to do that, because I could be deluged. I have been almost over the last year with a lot of different types of requests. And I love the work, but I know as an sort of a empathic introvert who can play the extrovert really well, I need space between these engagements. And so that question of how best to meet this moment's really beautiful opportunities is what I'm called to address. And right now, it looks like just creating more space for writing and practicing and caring.
Which is beautiful. I will touch base with you later on. How is that going? Because I need that as well at this moment in my life. What am I called to do? Yeah. And if I know we all struggle with things in our life, be it anxiety, depression, trauma, any sort of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
how should people take the first step forward when they recognize, okay, I'm going through this? So according to you, Rhonda, how should people approach their lives from trauma towards healing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that as much as possible, finding a little bit, like really asking, like, what of all the things that might be distressing or difficult, what is well within me right now? And finding from that place of like, just getting back in touch with just enough of what is well. We can kind of downregulate enough, take some deep breaths, and then start to be very intentional about attending to how we are or are not, like allowing ourselves to feel supported and loved. I mean, I'm speaking a lot about love because I do think, A, that's what we need when we're in distress. And B, it's actually a really hard thing to give ourselves when we're in distress or to even realize we deserve. I just think that first thing is just like noticing what is well. If it's hard to see how you can bring love, just like realizing what's safe enough right where we are, who in our lives, is there one person that when we talk to, we get a little bit of a reminder of the goodness of who we really are, that we don't have to prove ourselves with. So I do think being in relationships that are supportive and sustaining is really helpful and important. And to reach out for those when we are feeling in need of support. And it can be with a counselor. We don't happen to have the beauty of a kind of a close personal relationship or even family. We can find counselors and coaches who can kind of play that kind of role, who can give us a mirror of our goodness, of our beauty when we have gotten to a place in the many ways that any one of us can, where we're sort of disconnected with our goodness. And to me, that's what's called for. I've worked with a lot of people in distress, and a lot of that work, I'm not a therapist, but I have been in these positions of engaging with folks who are feeling that need of a reminder of what's good and that the good is always here. There's actually so much. Jon Kabat-Zinn famously says, if we're breathing, there's more right with us than wrong with us, which is, again, some people see that as some sort of an invitation to not do the harder work to make things even better. But I don't think of it that way. I think of it as that very humble way of reminding us because I've seen people in real distress, and I know a little bit about what that can be like in my own, experience, though, again, I certainly haven't suffered in the ways that some have. But to know that we deserve to heal and that something good is within us and that we can always be stronger and better, that's what I hope my life and my work help connect folks to. And that's what I think is the thing that when we're in distress, we're being called in some way. Something about our life is saying, no, remember who you are. You belong here. You deserve to be at ease. You deserve to feel at home and to feel like you can thrive and flourish, no matter where you come from, no matter what the world is telling you right now about where you belong. You deserve this or else you wouldn't be here. That's, to me, what life itself tells us. We belong here.
And recognizing that we are struggling is the first step towards healing.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yes, Rhonda, it has been a great conversation. Is there anything else you think we should explore or any important thing you think we should dive into right now?
I don't think so. I mean, it seems like we've covered a lot of really juicy things. I would only say that maybe the last thing is, while for me, being alive is a real inspiration, but part of that is recognizing that we don't have forever necessarily, right? At some point, life comes to an end, right? And so remembering that is also like a quickening, like whenever I'm like tempted to fall asleep and not work and not turn toward whatever way that I might make my life just a little bit better, I try and remember that this life is here and now. None of us knows how long we have. So yeah, and just to name that is another way that I practice to kind of keep me humbly seeking to turn toward life and not take it for granted every moment.
Thank you. And it feels to me that it is a perfect place to wrap up this conversation, Rhonda. Where would you like our listeners to learn about you and your work?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be in this conversation with you, Nishant. Well, so you can find me on RhondaVMagee.com, right? So I have a webpage there, and you can certainly connect up with me by just leaving your name and getting on my list, so to speak. I don't send it out. In fact, I famously, just over the last year and a half, I sent out a total of 3 newsletters. So I'm going to do it probably more frequently, but I'm also available. You can find me on the socials, and I'm on a variety of apps like mindfulness.com, a new app that I recently joined, Insight Timer, 10% Happier. There are these various ways that you can find me out there.
And your important Twitter feed at RVMagee, RVMagee. It's one of the beautiful Twitter feed folks you will find.
Thank you so very, very much. I really, really have been honored to be in this conversation with you today.
Thank you so much. It is my honor, and people can find all the show notes and all the links at nishantgarg.me/podcast. So Rhonda, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Nishant. Be well. Be well.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode today. If you did enjoy this, please subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, or you can visit https://nishantgarg.me, NISHANTGARG.me. You can also share this episode with your loved ones to help them live a fulfilled life. You are not alone in this journey. We all struggle in life. There is no shame in talking about it. I go through my highs and lows. I get depressed, and these practices help me in living a resilient life. You can also do this. You got this. Don't judge yourself. You are doing the best you can. And thank you so much again.